just physical, mental, spiritual. Zealous Wellness with Mike Hollis.
Hey there, and welcome to another episode of Zealous Wellness with Mike Hollis. I'm your host, and how about March Madness? I'm sure you've watched a lot of the basketball games. I'm not, as you can tell, I'm not a huge basketball fan, but I do watch the March Madness, and I've been watching it this year. And I got to say, my I guess 3 teams that I was kind of more or less rooting for, they're all out, so I don't really. I mean, I'll watch for entertainment purposes, but my Idaho Vandals, believe it or not, you probably never heard of Idaho Vandals. Maybe some of you have. In the state of Idaho, in Moscow, Idaho, that's my alma mater. That's where I went to school. They were out in the first round pretty brutally. They got beat up. They only scored like 47 points in the game. But and then Gonzaga. Gonzaga's from my hometown, Spokane, Washington. So I've been a Gonzaga fan for a while since they've been good. Of course, I can watch them, here in Florida. And when they make the March Madness tournaments, I always enjoy watching them. But they're out too. So, and then of course Florida Gators, they're out as well, which was kind of surprising, shocking to me, because I've actually been to a couple of their games this year. Well, one for sure. I was invited to another, couldn't make it. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely intense when it comes to that kind of stuff, especially for young college kids. I mean, I remember when I played football at the University of Idaho, it was pretty intense. I mean, it was a big Division I AA FCS, I guess these days, program. So pretty big deal, and a lot of people were at the games, and everyone knew you, of course, and you were kind of a celebrity on campus, but. That was kind of cool. But yeah, with the guest I'm going to have tonight, we're going to talk a lot about the mental side of anything in life, whether it's performance or jobs and projects, things like that, and just kind of how to influence yourself. And I've always talked about we as human beings are much more capable than we think we are with a lot of things in life. And when you apply yourself, you sometimes surprise yourself. When you apply yourself in ways that you didn't think were possible. And I give myself as a perfect example. I'm 5'7", 5'8" on a good day, I'd like to say, but 180 pounds as an average athlete, and I played in the NFL for 9 years. And so, anything is possible if you look at that. And I wasn't an incredible athlete, I just got good at kicking and found a good method and a style that worked for me and ran with it. So, but it did take a lot of mental concentration, a lot of mental tricks. I call them tricks because you kind of have to trick your brain into thinking a different way. Because we're kind of taught to think certain ways, and just instinctually we think certain ways. And so with my guest today, we are going to discuss a lot about that and just what he's up to and what he's doing and how he has done what he's done. You guys are going to see some pretty cool credentials that he's got. So with that said, we're going to pause for a second and have a quick break, a little word from our sponsor. And when we get back, we'll jump right into it. I'll introduce our guest, Chris Harrison. So here's a break from our moment that we can reflect on a little commercial, and then we'll get back and we'll talk to Chris.
It is possible. It's different this time. I'm showing up for myself because now I know that weight isn't about effort alone. It's not just calories in, calories out. For years, the world told us it was simple. Eat less, move more, try harder. But science has shown us it's more complex than that. It's a real metabolic condition. That's where GLP-3 comes in. Powered by MBC 267, a naturally derived peptide complex discovered in salmon from the Norwegian Sea and select mushrooms. GLP-3 works with the body's own system to help manage appetite and support metabolic balance. No fighting your body, no forced outcomes, just support where it actually matters. Because when you address the real factors at play, progress feels possible. I'm becoming the best version of myself. This is me and GLP-3.
And welcome back. Today I've got Chris Harris with us. He is a recognized authority on mindset and elite performance, helping leaders and sales teams in over 60 countries, strengthening execution, discipline, and results. He's a bestseller author of 14 books, including the Book of Mindset. He teaches identity-driven frameworks that connect performance and purpose, elevate clarity for leaders, and drive measurable improvement in competitive environments. You can reach him at chris@thewarriormaker.com, or his website is chrisharrisllc.com. Chris, thank you for joining the show, buddy. Me and you got a lot to talk about.
Thanks for having me. That was a great commercial. I think I'm going to order some.
There you go.
There
you go. It's good stuff. Good stuff. So tell me, what got you into this originally? Where did you stem? Give us some background on what you've developed and where you came from.
So started off when I was a kid. My mom got sent to prison. She was a heroin addict, heroin dealer. That caused me to become homeless, and then of course I got thrown into the protective services program. Lived with lots of different families. So by the time I turned 18, kind of as my birthday gift to myself, I enlisted into the military. A few months later, I graduated high school and off I went. And, I really just didn't have any self acceptance, self-value, self-love, self-worth. And so I really had to start on a journey to get that. And I got a lot of it through martial arts, and one of the good things about my childhood was living with all these different families. I got to train in a lot of different martial arts systems. And so that was kind of my role model, father figure, where do you get your, kind of strength and honor, who taught me those principles. So I served in the military for 4 years. And then after I got out, I became a private contractor where I trained elite special forces for 25 years worldwide. And, when you think of mindset, Green Berets, Navy SEALs, Rangers, Delta, they are the epitome of mindset. And I taught elite close quarters combat, but I had to infuse mindset into everything. It was very important to the leaders that hired me. Don't bring no weak sauce around our elite performers. These guys are very, very hard to replace, and they're very expensive to train. And then, so after doing that for 25 years, I just physically couldn't do it anymore. When they're 28 and I'm 28, it's fine. The problem is when I'm 48 and they're all still 28, because it's they don't get older. They just stay right around 28. And so I had to pivot, and I pivoted into corporate America. And I realized very quickly that the principles that I taught and that I practiced for those 25 years were very applicable in the corporate arena, especially in high pressure sales environments, and where effective leadership was needed. And so I started doing keynote speaking. I've been writing books for 25 years, but I really shifted what I was writing about to more, performance and mindset. And it's been an incredible journey, and it's amazing to me, I can walk into a room and say, hey, raise your hand if you know mindset is vitally important. And almost everyone will raise their hand. And then I'll say, okay, now tell me the difference. If you raise your hand if you know the difference between mindset, belief, and attitude. And very few people raise their hands. So, my journey is really to teach you what mindset is, not to teach you how important it is. Most people already have buy-in for that. But I want to teach audiences, one, what is the difference between mindset and then all of these other things that sound like mindset? And then why is it so hard to change, and how can we change it? And so that's the sort of stuff I get into.
That's very cool. And thinking back when I was, trying to play in the NFL, my theory was, and my mindset, and really nobody taught me this. It's just something that I kind of just morphed into. And it was more like, because I knew my size and my lack of athletic ability was going to be a challenge for me to be as good as I could be as far as the level is concerned of football. And my mindset was, I want to take baby steps and learn every single day and improve every single day. And my mindset was, I want to be as physically good as this body can be. My athletic ability, my mindset, my strength, my size, all that, whatever I could apply and be as good as I physically could be at kicking a football, and whatever level that got me to, I have to be okay with, because I have to be honest with myself, and knowing that I'm working really hard and trying to get to the best of my abilities, doing the training that I was taught and the working out and all the stuff, the blood, sweat, and tears. But it was just a challenge for me to, and I love kicking, of course, I'm really passionate about it. The challenge for me was just to be as good as I could be because I was just curious. I'm, man, I want to, and of course, then it stemmed into, a higher level college football. And then NFL, like I now got some NFL scouts looking, are you kidding me? So I never had a goal of playing in the NFL. I was just trying to be as good as I can be, and it just happened to land me at the highest level of football in the world. So mindset is a huge deal when it comes to your thoughts and your perception of your own self. How do you deal with people like that as far as like, how do you teach people that they are a lot more capable than they actually think they are?
About 5% of what goes on is in our conscious mind, okay? And then 95% is in the subconscious mind. So when somebody tells me, hey, I think I'm, anytime we use the word I, it's our ego talking, okay? And ego is not a bad thing, and ego is not a good thing. It's kind of morally neutral. It's, it's like saying, is money good or bad? Are drugs good or bad? Well, it all depends on who's holding them and what they're doing with them, right? Ego can be bad, and ego can be good. But it's where we form our identity. So when someone says, I want to, or I'm going to, what they don't understand is it's stuff that's coming out of their mouth, and it's kind of being generated, by the conscious mind, that 5%. But it's really all coming from what's under the surface, the subconscious mind. And so we think that we're in control, and this is what I want, and this is what I'm saying, and this is what I'm going to do, and these are the goals I'm going to establish. But there's an operating system. There's a hard drive. That the conscious mind is kind of like the screen of this computer, the keyboard. It's the mouse. It's the speakers, the video camera, the microphone. It's all the peripheral stuff. But what really is going on? It's that that tower computer with a hard drive in it that's down by my feet, and that's what we have to get access to because. Saying it and believing it is not enough. Mindset is what occupies that real precious, invaluable space between stimulus and response. Mm-hmm. Think about that for a moment. The space between stimulus and response, that's life, and that's mindset. And that is what we need to learn to master if we want to improve ourselves, either personally, professionally, spiritually.
Wow, that was I like that. And I knew because I coach kicking too, and I always talk to these kickers about their subconscious. I'm battling their subconscious. I'm battling their instincts because the things that I teach are different than what they think kicking is. Anybody who comes to me with an open mind and has been in my opinion, brainwashed by all these other kicking coaches out there because what they do is they applaud the kickers for doing what they would normally do anyways, and then they take their money. And I'm like, if you go to a camp and you don't do anything awkward or you don't feel awkward, you don't do anything new and feel different, then you didn't learn anything. So when I'm talking about with that, it's you're right, exactly. So, with regards to the athletes that I'm working with, when I deal with somebody who cares too much about the result, and that's another thing that I think that I've tricked my mind into thinking because people would ask me like, how do you deal with all the pressure? You got a game-winning kick, and you gotta make the kick to win the game. And I said, this is going to sound really crazy, but just hear me out. I said, I didn't care where the ball went, and they look at me like I'm crazy. Like, what do you mean you don't care where the ball went? I said, okay, now I'm a mechanical kicker. I rely on my process to do the work for me and the job for me, right? So if I care about the result too much before I've even kicked a football, put my foot on the football itself, then I'm going to do something different than my process that I've learned to do that was successful. Why would I mess with success thinking that it's, like I've got to do something different this time because it's more important. It's a game winner. Every kick is the same. And so when you're dealing with people in the general sense of when you're out there speaking and giving your advice on things, do you ever come across people that look too far ahead? I'm one that is day by day by day by day, and then eventually the ultimate goal will happen later on. But if I'm doing these little things early on, baby steps, day by day by day, and improving, then the end result will end up being good. So do you deal with people like that as well?
Look, 90% of the people I deal with look too far ahead. And I explain it like this. The majority of people, and we know this, there's lots of studies out there that prove this. But the majority of people that establish a goal don't complete a goal, right? They don't cross the finish line. And if you want to know why, there's a couple of reasons why, but one of the main reasons why, and I teach this, is because we focus on the goal. Look, the number one purpose for establishing a time-bound and measurable goal is we really want the good stuff. And the good stuff is that is the catalyst for creating a process. Okay? The process is the gold. The goal is way too far out there. And what's going to happen is we will lose our motivation because we're not having small daily dopamine wins. We need dopamine wins. We need that reward that the dopamine provides. And so what we do is we set the goal and then we use it to create the process that gives us the little small daily wins. And then we focus on that process and we forget about the goal. And what happens is we may have a bad day, but we didn't break the process, right? If we're focused on the goal and we have a bad day, we're like, well, heck, what's the point? I might as well just go ahead and just whatever, fill in the blanks. So the process is also very important because within that process, we embed our purpose, our why. And so if you've got a process that is embedded with your why, something that you're passionate about, now this is where resilience comes in. Resilience has to have something to sink its teeth into and hold on to when the stuff gets hard and you're up against the wall, right? The game-winning kick. And so if you've got process, you're way ahead of the game. And if you've got process that's commingled with a strong why or something you're passionate about, you're most likely going to achieve that goal.
Good, yeah. What kind of things, of course, when people ask me this as well, and I'm just loving this because it fits so well with everything that I'm talking about too, and clearly I'm not as knowledgeable as you are, but I've just kind of learned this stuff kind of as I went, and even now that I'm coaching, I'm learning teaching the things that I kind of learned on my own. But how do you deal with, what do you recommend for people to deal with failure? And more specifically, I've always talked about if you weren't, we all are going to fail. We're human. We are going to fail. Okay, use that failure as a learning process, and so that you can, don't look at it as a negative. Look at it as a positive. But what kind of mindset do you talk with your crowds and people that you deal with about the failures that they're going to experience?
Well, the first two things I do is I say, look, we have really just jacked up bad information about two words, all right? Most people have been taught the wrong definition of success, and most people have been taught the wrong definition of failure. And when you come out of the gate towards some kind of worthwhile goal, meaningful pursuit, some really important desired outcome, and you've got the wrong definition of what success is or what winning looks like, and you've got the wrong definition of what failure looks like, you're in a lot of trouble, because now what's going to happen is, at the first sign of trouble, you're now going to be screwing with your identity. All right. And we need to be protecting our identity, not messing with it. So success is very simple. Just define it as this: it is the attainment of a goal. I used to think if you were a Rolex, you were successful. I used to think we were so poor. I thought that if you were able to get all 4 new tires at once, you were rich, right? I mean, like we could only get 1 tire at a time, and we usually had to go find it at some used place. But, if you wore a Rolex, if you had a CEO or a president title, if you wore a suit to work, you were successful. No, that's a bad definition. And most of us that are listening to this podcast have been taught the wrong definition of success. But what if we just said that success is the attainment of a goal, regardless of what the goal is? And then failure, to me, there's only 2 ways I can fail, okay? I don't fail. Look, if I decide to do something, I'm either going to win or I'm going to learn, all right? Because to me, failure is there's 2 ways I can fail. 1, I let fear keep me from going for it. Okay, that's failure. If there's something that I want to do and I feel like I could probably, have a pretty good shot at as long as I put in the work, and I choose not to even start because I'm afraid, okay, that's failure. And then number 2 is just quitting, midstream, just quitting. Not falling down 7 times, getting up 8. That's not failure. It's just saying, you know what, I've had enough. So if you're not willing to start because you're afraid, and if you know that there's a chance you'll just turn around and head back down the hill because it's just too damn hard. So if you tell me, look, I'm going to start. In fact, I've already started. I'm already in it. Okay, well then half of the reason you could fail is already out the window. Are you going to quit? I'm not going to quit. They may throw me out. They may come repo my car. I may have to live on my brother-in-law's couch, but I'm not quitting. Well, then there is no failure.
Yeah. That's a great way to look at it, and that reminds me of myself growing up, and of course I've missed kicks. I've missed a lot of kicks, but that was part of the process and getting good at what I did. And a lot of people don't, again, going back to this whole concept of a lot of people don't realize what they're capable of, because part of the reason is they second guess themselves, and they think it might be too hard, or it might be too difficult, and they're very fearful of failure. And so they don't even try because they've already got this preloaded intention of failing. They think they're going to, because they don't understand how capable they actually are. And I always talk about in the podcast about with in general life, like with lifting, as far as fitness, as far as your diet, there's always that hump that you have to kind of get over. But a lot of people fail before they even get to the hump. And so, you understand that diet and exercise, both of them, and even success in a certain skill like kicking a football, they all take time to develop. Now, with diet, you're not gonna lose. If you start eating healthy, you're not gonna drop your 10 pounds in 2 days. So if you're expecting, and that's another thing too, I think people look too far ahead and try to expect different results, and they're not happy with what they've found themselves into. Oh, this isn't working, I give up, and so my point is that people give up too quickly before they even understand what they're actually capable of doing, and just know, they don't know really the fact that they just stuck around a little bit longer than they would have felt. And I'm telling you from personal experience, that's exactly where I'm coming from. Is, I've shared this with I've had 4 back surgeries, and after I retired, the last thing I want to do is see a weight room, because I lived in the weight room for 9 years and was doing all kinds of lifting. And I'm like, man, that's the last thing I'm going to do. Well, guess what? My back started hurting. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Of course, and then my diet went to crap, and I'm eating just a bunch of junk food because, whatever, I'm retired, I'm good. And that played a huge role in my mentality and how I am right now today, because I didn't like how I was then. And that was a couple times. I went through a divorce and did the same thing again. Stopped working out, got real heavy. And so a lot of things, happened in my life that made me stronger because of those things that I just, I got myself into. And so that mental aspect is really, something to look back on and think, okay, well, I don't want to be like that anymore. And I think that, I don't know if you've run into people like that or things that when you're talking to people in your speeches and stuff, that do you relate those kind of real life situations to people, and what do you teach them on how to get over that concept of the fear of trying something because they've already kind of predetermined that they can't do it?
Well, I'll answer that 2 ways, and that's a great question, by the way, Mike. The first thing regarding fear of failure, get it in your head. There's only 2 people that you have to impress in your lifetime. 2. The 8-year-old version of yourself and the 80-year-old version of yourself. Everybody else, let them think what they're going to think. All right, so if you get your mind wrapped around that, your fear of failure is going to be completely it'll definitely be weakened, maybe diminished. And then the second thing is, when all this self-sabotage starts to happen, and that's what we're talking about, self-sabotage. I'll tell you where that happens. So we want to make a change in our life. We want to improve ourselves, either physically, mentally, spiritually, whatever, build better relationships, set stronger boundaries, break old habits, create new habits, and it just doesn't work. And we don't know why, and then we get frustrated, and then we just start spiraling. Next thing you know, we're eating, we went from eating, the paleo diet to now we're pulling over and buying Little Debbie oatmeal cream pies, at the 7-Eleven. And we don't know why. Well, here's why. All right, our subconscious mind, which is where our mindset lives, okay? It lives in the subconscious, not in the conscious mind. And it has a 7-foot, 400-pound bodyguard that's protecting the only entrance to it. It's called our critical faculty. All right. It does not let in new ideas, new change, this, self-positive talk, mantra, all of the stuff that we, willpower, self-motivation. It's not letting it in. It's designed to keep out anything that's unfamiliar or that looks unsafe. And it doesn't like change. So we're going to call that 7-foot bodyguard, that mental firewall. We're going to call him Critical Carl. Okay? So if you can't find a way to get past Critical Carl, you're going to go back to whatever you're doing and probably do it more than you did it before. So one of the things I teach is, well, how in the world do you get past Critical Carl? Because he's not buying your fake ID.
Interesting. That's interesting. Yeah, because you're only competing against yourself, and it brings me to a thought too. Like when we talk about kicking in football, it is like my competition is myself. I'm not competing against anybody on the football field. It's funny because Tom Coughlin, our head coach, used to in our pregame, the night before the night before the game in the hotel, we would go through a team meeting, and he would call out the guys that are competing against each other name by name. Mark Brunell versus the other quarterback. I'm like, well, he's not really versing the other quarterback. And then kickers, of course, Mike Hollis versus whoever the kicker was. I'm like, that doesn't make any sense at all. In a lot of cases, people can find themselves, as their own worst enemy because they second guess themselves, they overthink it, they think too hard. When you deal with like pressure, how would you tell someone, how would you be like getting to like the sports psychology part of this? What kind of things can you suggest that would help somebody to deal with pressure? I know we probably covered a lot of it already in a roundabout way, but is there anything specific that you would focus on when you were, like if I was to coach? And I never had a sports psychologist. I never needed one, in my opinion. I just had to trust my form. That was my mental, aspect of kicking. And so how would you go about explaining to somebody how to deal with pressure?
Well, pressure is directly tied to fear. Okay. And so the pressure is the direct result. Well, let's just talk about pressure and fear let's say they're kind of symbiotic in this situation, right? The only way to really silence it is through consistent repetition, right? The more times you practice that process of kicking, from all of those, different distances, or, I don't know exactly, like, were you kicking field goals or were you punting or were you kicking off, which one of those, because those are all three a little bit different, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But the more you practiced your process and came to the point to where you relied on and earned confidence, right? Because the opposite of pressure is confidence in your ability to perform. Because if there's pressure, that means that there is something that is expected of you. You need to deliver. Either, you got a quota that you got to hit or your team has to hit by, and usually there's a deadline, right? So there's usually something that's expected of you, and there's usually a deadline to perform by. So that's pressure. If there's not something that's expected of you specifically or your team that you're leading or responsible for, and there's not a deadline, I don't know where the pressure's coming from. All right, I wouldn't even call that pressure at that point. That's just anxiety. That's just shit that's running rent free, right? That shouldn't be. But if you want the pressure to reside, if you want it to diminish, to weaken, to lessen, well, that comes from confidence, and confidence comes from repetition.
It goes exactly in the same lines I talk about, like trusting the process. You've developed a process with kicking, of course, that is successful, right? So you've seen yourself kick all these balls. You've made a lot of kicks in practice, and you've gotten really good. Why would you second guess the process that you've gotten really good at just because the points matter more? And, usually kickers would, have a harder time. I remember when the NFL moved the extra point back to 33 yards instead of a 20-yard field goal or extra point. It was a 33-yard extra point. And the first year, there was a lot of kickers that missed. And I knew exactly why because I was there clearly. And it's very embarrassing to have, after every game we get our stats and we get to see that ourselves. I can look and see my name. Oh, Mike Hollis missed extra point. Oh, man. Everybody in the league is going to see that. I'm so embarrassed. I missed an extra point. It's embarrassing, right? So I think when that rule change happened and how all these kickers that were, the veterans, the guys that kind of knew better, they did okay. The younger guys that didn't quite have that ability to be strong and not do anything different, they were the ones that were all uptight about it and missing kicks left and right. The classic example, Jason Myers was the kicker here in Jacksonville for 3 or 4 years, 2 or 3 years, I think, and we cut him because of that. He didn't have very good field goal extra point percentage the first year that the rule changed. And then next thing you know, he goes to the Jets and goes to a Pro Bowl. Then he goes to Seattle and goes to a Pro Bowl. And then he wins the Super Bowl and all. I mean, look at him now. But we cut him because he couldn't make an extra point. But that was him back then. It was his early time. Jaguars were his first team. And so I think, because he was so young and maybe a little bit inexperienced, he didn't know how to deal with that kind of stuff. And so when you think about athletes in general, and you talked about like that fear and the mentality of having, what's expected of you. The pressure comes when people are looking at you. Me as a kicker, man, yeah, heck yeah, I knew subconsciously that there was people looking at me in the stadium, and then millions of other people around the world, whether if it was in a really high profile game, the AFC Championship game or whatever, which I've played in 2 of them, but I ignored that. And that's what I think people can't do sometimes. They can't ignore that there's other people watching. And I think that's a big deal with the mindset is what are others thinking about you? How do you deal with people in that sort of mentality where they're worried about what others think about them?
Well, I said earlier that, like for the sake of this conversation, that we're going to define mindset as the space between stimulus and response. So anytime you're in a situation to where you feel pressure, or you're afraid to fail, stop for a moment and say, okay, in this particular situation, what is the stimulus and what is the response? Okay, so in your situation, kicking an extra point, well, the stimulus is the moment the ball is hiked. The response is the moment your foot makes contact with that ball. Mm-hmm. So owning the space of mindset, mastering the space, in that example is from the time the ball is hiked until however long it takes for you to make contact with that ball to where you can't take it back. You can't change the process.
Out of your control.
All right, so you want to master the mindset of that space from ball height, you kick the ball, which means that you need to do that about 10,000 times. And that repetition that builds that confidence, you own that space. And how we own it is we make that space an automatic instinctive reaction that does not require our input anymore. Remove yourself from the equation.
An automatic instinctual reaction. I love that. And that's what, again,
remove yourself from the equation.
I get that. That is so cool. And one thing you mentioned a second ago too was about, I kind of talked about it with regards to, focus. Well, after you kick the ball, you can't do a thing about it. And so what happens sometimes is kickers, I'm just thinking kickers in general because I know a lot about them, but with wind situations, with rainy cold, whatever the situation may be, these are things that you cannot control. And I find as a coach that there's a lot of kickers out there that worry too much about things that they have no control over whatsoever. I had a kid today actually at the park ask me how do you are you focused on the guys when they're coming? And he's from London, so he doesn't really know much about American football. But I'm teaching him American football right as a kicker, but he's a soccer player, of course. But he said, "Oh, does that bother you when the guys are coming at you?" And I'm like, "Well, that's not my job. My job is to kick the football. Well, aren't you worried about getting hit?" I'm like, no, I got my guys that are protecting me. Sometimes I have gotten hit, but not very often, but my job is not to prepare myself to get hit. My job is to kick a football. I can't worry. I can't control that. If a guy let a guy through and he's coming right at me to hit me, obviously, if he doesn't block the ball and hits me without blocking the ball, it's a penalty and he's going to get penalized and we might, win a game, whatever the case may be. So there's a lot of consequences with that kind of stuff. But it's really interesting when you deal with people that focus too much on things that they have absolutely no control over, and their mind is just going crazy. And those are the ones you have to kind of settle down and say, listen, you can't focus on things you can't control. You got to focus on what your abilities are and what do you do? What is your job? Your job is to do a certain process and a certain thing. If obviously you're on a team, other people have their own responsibilities. And so that's what makes it a team.
If you're focusing on something you have no control over, that's called irrational fear. Look, fear is supposed to be our counselor, okay? It's not supposed to be our jailer. And a rational fear is actually a gift. What makes fear rational is if it drives us to action, if it drives us to change, if it motivates us to do something a little different, a little better, to get off our tail. Okay, so that's a good thing. But irrational fear is when it's living rent free. I'm worried about it, I'm stressed about it, I'm anxious about it, but I'm not really doing anything to prevent that outcome from happening. That's irrational. And if that's living in your headspace, then you have the opposite of mindset. You have what's called an external locus of control, right? We have an internal locus of control where we basically just focus on the things that I can control. And then we have an external locus of control where we basically get our head wrapped around stuff that we have no control over. And now we're basically just letting fear, our subconscious mind is now basically running our life. Carl Jung, there's a quote from Carl Jung, a famous psychologist, and he said this. He said, until you can make your subconscious mind your part of your conscious mind, he said it will control your life and you will call it fate.
Wow, interesting. That's very cool.
And I'll give you something I learned from the special forces for 25 years. You know, here's another quote, and then I'll tie it to that quote. And it's from Alan Watts, okay? He said, you are under no obligation to be the same version of yourself you were 5 minutes ago. And that's how the special forces live. Every moment of every day, they're focused on how can I make myself better? Wow. How can I have a competitive edge over my enemy, over anyone who would do myself, my team, or my country great harm? How do I do that? I wake up and I say, you know what? My number one responsibility in this lifetime or in this role or as being an operator, whatever, my number one responsibility is to develop myself to my fullest. And when you think like that, then all of a sudden you hear someone say, you know, hey, you're under no obligation to be the same version of yourself you were 5 minutes ago. Of course, I understand that. That's why I live in this Kaizen, consistent state of improvement. And when we just start focusing on improving ourselves each and every day, the process, it's hard to be focused on things you have no control over. You don't have time for it. If you're focused on a bunch of stuff that you have no control over, you probably got too much time on your hands.
Yeah. I've always said this. I say, because I've talked to people in public, audiences as well, and I like to really refer to, the mindset that I carry is like, listen, every day, and going back to the baby steps, like you on any given day, you have to do what you can, the best of your ability. If you can, under any circumstances, whatever the circumstances were, if you did the best, truly did the best that you can do that day, and whatever the outcome was, you did your best, right? So you couldn't do any better. So at the end of every night, you look yourself in the mirror and say, was I truly to myself, as far as like understanding the concept of that I gave it my all and I truly gave it my all, then you've succeeded. That's what we talk about goal setting. I'm not a huge goal setter because of that reason only, because a lot of people don't, give a full effort and they'll like, yeah, I tried. Nah, did you truly try though? Did you give did you try to make yourself better? Did you do your best under the circumstances that you were given, the weather, things like that with kickers, of course. But if you can truly look at yourself in the mirror and honestly tell yourself that you did the best you could, you've succeeded. You didn't fail anything. You might have not made your a couple kicks that day that you were hoping to make, but you did your best. You honestly did your best. And I think people get a little bit too caught up into that failure thing again. And sometimes the things that don't control, you can't control, actually control the result, and you've made it a failure. And I think people don't understand that, it's really not out of their control. It was out of their control, but that what they can control, as long as they did the best that they physically could do under those circumstances, then they've succeeded.
Absolutely. And when we miss a kick in life, we have to be very honest about, why we missed. And so I'll give you an example. There's accidents, there's mistakes, and there's poor choices. All right. They're all completely different. So if you miss that kick, ask yourself, after the game's over and you're in the locker room or you're driving home, whatever, ask yourself, was that an accident? let's just say I just before I made the kick, I slipped. I lost my footing, right? Because of the wet turf or whatever. Was it a mistake? The ball was hiked and I stepped forward too late. I delayed, like I froze, whatever. Or was it just a poor choice? I calculated wrong for the wind. And so the first thing we got to do if we want to be in this consistent state of improvement, did I do the best I could? Yeah, but I still missed. Okay, well, let's call it what it was. Was it an accident, a mistake, or a poor choice? Well, that was actually a poor choice. All right, so through that level of honesty and transparency, now we can grow and get better. Because remember, I don't miss kicks. I either make kicks or I learn.
There you go. That was very, very well said. Is there anything else that you'd like to talk? We're going to wrap up here, but is there anything that you'd like to talk about to our viewers with regards to your business and what you do and where can they reach you, all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, just thewarriormaker.com. All my stuff's there. And, my newest book, the Book of Mindset, just came out on Audible literally like a week or two ago. And if you want to hear more about the mindset and subconscious mind and the critical faculty that's kind of guarding that gate, like all of that's in the Book of Mindset if you want to learn more about that.
Okay, very good, very good. Well, thank you so much, Chris. That was awesome. I love talking mindsets because I think differently than a lot of people, and I think a lot of people understand that. I'm very low-key, mellow because of the way I think, and just like, you know what, it's really not that big of a deal. There's a lot of people that put too much pressure on themselves, and they actually go the wrong way instead of just relaxing and just letting things kind of flow. I've got anxiety with kickers where they like to take off way too fast and do a bunch of things because that's what they think they need to do. And when I tell them don't do that, they're looking at me like whoa, wait, what? I thought that's what you have to do. I'm like, no. You have to rely on your whole mechanics to do all the work for you. And that's really a big selling point for me with my kickers as far as getting
there's no way you are a professional kicker in the NFL if you don't have something figured out about the mind.
Yeah.
Sorry, the odds, the statistics would say that anyone who's made it that far as a kicker, paid by the NFL to kick, you got something figured out about mindset that most people probably never will.
Yeah. And when people I've got the parents who ask me oh, do you deal with how do you get little Johnny to relax before the game and what's his mindset? How do you prepare him for a mindset, before the game? What kind of things is he thinking? I'm like, that's the sports psychologist job. I don't get involved in that because I never had one. I never needed one. It's because my mentality of kicking a football is just trusting the process. But the process that I've earned over time, of course, took a lot of mental strength too, to not care where the ball went. That's another thing too. But so there's a lot of fun stuff when it comes to the mindset and how we perceive things in life. And I definitely want everyone, all the viewers, to know that we definitely are so much more capable than we think we are. And it's just about the mindset, where your perceptions are, where your mindset is with regards to your capabilities. And we know that our brains are very, very powerful, and we just have to utilize the right parts of the brain to make us successful. So, Chris, thank you so much. Definitely one of our best shows, I think, especially on the mindset part. It's just awesome, and you're definitely a very intelligent man that has been doing this for a long time. And I know with martial arts, of course, that takes a lot of discipline and mindset too. So I can kind of relate. I do boxing, but that's not anything near to martial arts. But there's a lot of mindset play in there, and days I don't want to be there, I still show up. And so there's a lot of cool things with the mind. And thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll definitely look forward to possibly another time get you on the show as well. So everybody, thank you so much. Go ahead, Chris. Go ahead, Chris.
Great stuff. I really enjoyed it. Great conversation.
Awesome. Thank you.
And I'll give you the parent who came to you and said, talked about the son or the daughter or whatever, and they got to get their headspace right, and tell them this, okay? Tell them to create a future memory, a 5-second clip in their mind, a future memory of them, that the only way they'd be playing that clip is if they achieved a really big goal, okay? And that every time they feel themselves drifting off into stress, worry, anxiety, fear of failure, whatever, start playing that 5-second clip.
Yeah, that's a good point, because a lot of times guys will will imagine stuff, but we get into kind of like that second guessing, or that insecurity. That's another one that I use with guys, is they you start thinking that way, and then you start imagining the insecure part, and then the failure kind of pops in there, like, oh man, I can. And next thing you know, I'm visualizing a kick that went left. I'm like, what? Where did that go? Like, wait, I got to be back on the right track. And so I really do agree with that.
The subconscious mind doesn't know the difference between the past and the future, and it doesn't know the difference between reality and fantasy. Leverage that.
That's
Create
a good
something that's out there that's not true, that's fantasy, that's in the future. As far as it's concerned, it's true and it's now.
That's awesome. Great advice. Great, amazing advice for everybody. So, with that said, we will we'll disbark here, and then we'll definitely see you guys on another episode of Zealous Wellness with Mike Hollis. Thank you again, Chris, and we'll see you next time. Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you for watching Zealous Wellness with Mike Hollis. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe. See you next time.